Okay, I believe it's going to start now, so. And then Veda, if you'll just turn your camera off. Good stuff. Okay. Hello. Perfect. Thank you all for joining us. We will be starting soon. I'm just going to give a couple more minutes for folks to join. All right, well, I just wanted to thank all of you for joining us this afternoon, as I have the pleasure to introduce Dr. Michael R. Anderson, the Director of the International Relations and Global Studies, or IRG undergraduate program at the University of Texas at Austin. A historian by training, Dr. Anderson's research interests focus on trans-Pacific intellectual networks and unofficial diplomacy in the 20th century. He's the co-author of Political and Economic Foundations in Global Studies, and he serves as the associate editor of the Research Encyclopedia of the History of American Foreign Policy. Since 2013, Dr. Anderson has also been the faculty director of the IRG in France Study Abroad program. And in the spring of 2019, he was awarded the Leslie Wagner Centennial Teaching Fellowship by the College of Liberal Arts in recognition of his contributions to undergraduate honors projects. Dr. Anderson, the floor is yours. I welcome this discussion.
Well, thank you very much, Nick. It's a pleasure to be here, and thank you all for joining. Yeah, it's a real honor to be invited to help lead this breakout session. Just one thing Nick didn't mention about what I do, and that's outside of my duties as Director of the International Relations and Global Studies program at UT, my community work really works around the UN. I am on the board of the United Nations Association of Austin, and we seek to promote the UN and its work in the local Austin community. So I am not an unbiased person when it comes to these issues, and I certainly applaud your involvement in getting involved in the UN. And you can see, you know, my pin here, which represents the Sustainable Development Goals here. So I'm not going to pretend to be a completely unbiased observer here, and I know that you all are of course invested and involved in UN matters simply by being a part of this conference and taking part of your weekend to actually be involved in this. That's a real commitment, and I certainly applaud that. So yeah, I mean, what I would just simply say is that, you know, even as all of us here are broadly sympathetic to what the UN wants to do, right? We are at a moment in time in which it seems ever more clear that the liberal international order will still be with us one way or another, right? If the recent presidential election might have gone a different way, well, we would be having a different conversation right now about saying, well, what's next, or you know, just how quickly will it decline and fall? And so that's why I had this provisional title for my talk. You know, should we simply revive the UN, or does it need revamping? Does it need reorganizing? So just kind of very briefly, I just kind of lay out like, what does the UN do? Now, you all are involved in very much kind of Security Council type disputes, right, as a part of Model UN. And you know, crisis management, conflict resolution, these are important aspects of what the UN has done over the years, right? You all know probably about the various peacekeeping missions that have been launched. There are, I think, 14 or 15 still ongoing, 90,000 troops deployed all over the world. Okay, so you're familiar with that. But you know, want to remind you as well that back 75 years ago, when the UN Charter was ratified, just a few, it would have been what, on October 24th, I believe, in 1945. The UN put itself at its mission, not only keeping the peace, but also advancing human rights and justice issues, as well as helping better the lives of others. And so there is, a rights-based, and so the Universal Declaration of Human Rights and all the efforts in human rights can be traced back to the work of the UN. All of the efforts to help with development, the Millennium Development Goals in 2000, and now the Sustainable Development Goals, this can be traced to the UN. And of course, their work on the environment, from the Earth Summit 1992 down to the various climate meetings that have been happening. This is also through the UN. So there's a lot, and so there's a great record there for the UN. There's a lot to be celebrated, but I hope that in the course of our conversation, we can really talk about, well, how should it revamp and be better in the years ahead? And we're fortunate now that we no longer have to just crouch back in a defensive mode and say, defend at all costs. I think we can breathe a little bit easier now that we know that some kind of international order will be there, but just what kind of order do we want? So I hope that's the kind of conversation we can have today.
Yeah, of course. Thank you for those wonderful introductory remarks, Dr. Anderson. And I'd like to point out that I too am not an unbiased observer. You heard from my current boss, Dr. Waters, at your opening ceremony, where she spoke to some of the more broad goals of the United Nations and what they're trying to achieve. And in both her remarks and your remarks, Dr. Anderson, there's kind of this theme that global governance lies at the heart of many of the issues we're addressing now. But with that kind of being said, it seems that we're finding ourselves at a crossroads of sorts, at this tail of this very turbulent US election where foreign policy seemed to take sort of a backseat to domestic affairs. However, it seemed that in the background of all of these debates and talking points from political pundits, one point that seemed to be kind of glossed over and missed was that the US is currently sort of unraveling many of these international institutions. The US officially withdrew from the Paris Climate Accords the day after the election on November 4th, a decision set in motion back in 2017, and is now on track to withdraw from the WHO in January. Given that President-elect Biden has now been determined as serving as our next president of the United States, how do you feel this trend is going to continue? What do you see the US's role in sort of the global political stage? And do you think it will go back on some of its maybe decisions to unravel some of these international institutions?
Yeah, that's a good question and a fundamental one. It's a big one. I mean, I think so I'm a historian, as you have noted, and so I mean, I think that it's important not to romanticize too much the near recent past about saying, oh, before the current U.S. administration, that the U.S. had always been just this absolute champion of the UN in all respects, and that's hasn't always been the case. And indeed, I mean, if you go back even before the UN, the U.S. goes back and forth on its commitment to multilateralism and its interest in joining these kinds of organizations. As you all know from your high school history courses about the failure to ratify the Treaty of Versailles by the U.S. Senate in 1920, and some of the isolationist policies that the U.S. had in the 1930s, just before getting involved in World War II. And so you know that that tradition that Donald Trump and the Republicans, at least of the last few years, have represented, like, there is a strong tradition of that in the U.S. And so it should serve as a reminder to all of us that you can't take for granted that there's going to be a strong U.S. interest in these kinds of commitments. So, I mean, I think that it's an important matter to say, okay, well, then what are those? What should be the nature of those commitments, and how do we work as a good partner in this? I think that yes, I mean, I think we will resume our kind of good standing in the Paris Climate Accord. We won't withdraw from the World Health Organization. I suspect within a short time, we will announce that we're back in UNESCO, the UN Education, Scientific, and Cultural Organization that we formally withdrew from a couple of years ago. You know, there are others. I mean, we can go on. But just because we're back in doesn't, that doesn't still kind of fundamentally resolve some of the issues of, well, what should be the nature of that relationship? I mean, I think that for decades it was kind of presumed that we would that the U.S. Or that the international order was a largely U.S.-led order, or if it's not U.S.-led, I mean at least U.S. in conjunction with its wartime allies. But 75 years, that's a long time. That's a long time, and the world has changed, and also and we can talk about that in a later time. But as far as what the U.S. electorate expects as well, we have to have a real discussion among our fellow Americans about the role of America abroad. I mean, I think while I kind of disagree with much of what the current administration's foreign policy and objectives, I think one salutary effect of it is to kind of make us ask ourselves, well, should we be abroad? And certainly when it comes to military commitments abroad, I think that Donald Trump asked very hard questions about why are we here in Afghanistan, for instance. I mean, what is the end game? What are we supposed to do? And so I think that it would be a mistake if President-elect Biden simply kind of comes in and says, we're just going to have a reset and let's just kind of go back to how we were doing things 4 years and 1 day ago. That would not be wise in my estimate. I mean, the world has moved on in some ways without us, and I think that the American people are a little more circumspect about the U.S. global role. Certainly, my students that I see in class are a little more circumspect, and I'd be kind of curious to hear what you all think as well. I mean, just about the role of the U.S. and what does U.S. leadership mean for the rest of the 21st century. In my view, that we need to be far more adept at listening to what others have to do, and whether you call that leading from behind or kind of some other measure, but we need to be better at finding consensus. The old days in which the U.S. could really be a strident forward model, those are over, or at least that the conditions that gave rise to that are now over. So so that's kind of a long-winded way of answering your question.
Yeah, and so you mentioned sort of harkening back to a time where the U.S. was kind of at the forefront and spearhead of leading various like UN initiatives, and we can't just go back there. And there's sort of this rhetoric of building back better now. Looking kind of historically at the U.S.'s role in sort of the United Nations, something that I find extremely interesting is sort of the way that the U.S. seems to champion many of these international causes and human rights treaties. I'm thinking of the International Criminal Court and the Rome Accords particularly, but then doesn't actually join them. And so there somewhat seems to be a disconnect between sort of the ideology of the United States in pushing sort of humanitarian and human rights causes, but then actually not signing on to the global compacts that they're asking other nations to do so. Why do you think this disconnect exists, and sort of what is the role it's going to play sort of in building back better?
You're absolutely right, Nick. I mean, the U.S. for decades, this is not just the Trump administration, for decades has tried to have its cake and eat it too. That is to say, we are champions of human rights. We are working for this around the world. But when it comes to formal obligations and signing on to international treaties that promote those, we are not parties to it. Every year, this from being in my class, Nick, we talk about all the conventions on human rights. There have been 18 major conventions on human rights since 1948, since the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. And you can look at a map and see the UN Commissioner on Human Rights has a map say, all right, just how many of these treaties have states signed on to around the world. And let's see, I mean, we could take a poll here to see what people think about that. But the reality is that the US has signed on to only 5, has only ratified 5 of the 18 major human rights treaties that have been kind of developed over the last several decades. Why? This this shows in some ways that the problems in the U.S. Senate for actually ratifying them. Of course, for any treaty, you need 2/3 of the U.S. Senate to actually pass to ratify a treaty. And as we all know, it's difficult to get the U.S. Senate to do much, especially a 2/3 majority. And frankly, it just hasn't been on the radar of the American public. So the American public can continue to believe, oh, well, we are championing these things and we believe in them, but there's no pressure on our legislators to actually follow through and to do this. And the rest of the world sees it. And it, unfortunately, it then undermines our ability to tell others, you need to sign on to these when we ourselves are not. So that's I think one way that we are going to have less and less of an opportunity to simply get away with that.
And so, in speaking about accountability, Jake George kind of asks, even if we rejoin the Paris Climate Accords, has our reputation in the international community been damaged beyond repair due to pulling out of many of these international accords and poor response to COVID-19, whereas you're speaking to not even initially signing on to the accords?
Yeah, I mean, I think it depends on the specific agreement you're talking about. I think that, yes, our reputation or our reliability, I think maybe is the key here. You know, just how sure can the rest of the world be that we are going to follow through on these commitments? And I mean, especially when it comes to things like the Paris Climate Accord, which was that too was not ratified, and that was not ratified by the U.S. Senate. If it were, Trump wouldn't have been able to pull out. Because it would be law. I mean, it would be a legislative act, not just a U.S. executive decision or commitment, which is what the Obama administration made. So, and executive commitments can be unmade by the next administration. So, absolutely, you're right to point out that we are less reliable than we might be. And so, yes, other states are going to have to hedge their willingness to just buy into a U.S.-led program when they don't know, in 4 years' time, we could have another party come in that also has a more isolationist bent. So, but I think that when it comes to something like Paris Climate Accord, I think that, and other issues, most countries, from my sense anyway, were saying, all right, we are going to give you, the United States, a mulligan, or we're going to give you a 4-year pass. You can make a decision here, but then if Trump were reelected, I think then you would have seen a real massive turn away from looking to the U.S. for any kind of leadership on many of these issues. I will suspect that many will say, okay, we're happy to have you back. We're now going to get you back involved in all these groups. But you're right. I mean, at a certain level, you can't forget that you can get burned, and that's part of the American electoral system.
And kind of in line with what you're kind of speaking to, we had 2 other delegates, Amar and Sohan, ask, what is it that we can do to add additional pressure onto these legislators, specifically students and citizens of the U.S., due to not only pressure legislators, but raise awareness of the policies and humanitarian treaties that the U.S. is championing, but not following through with. You serve on the board of the UN National Association, one of the chapter organizations here in Austin. And so part of that role is advocating for sort of policy changes and adoptions of the SDGs and things like that. So if you could speak to that a little bit, I think they appreciate that discourse as well.
That's right. Yeah, and that's a great question. Just how do we get involved and how do we do more? So in addition to the UN Association of the United States with various chapter organizations, we have student organizations that are connected to those UNA chapters, and those are known as Gen UN, or so Generation UN. And so there is a Gen UN student org at the University of Texas, and I'm sure at other colleges and universities. And that is a wonderful way of trying to, kind of make that connection between what the UN is doing globally. And it's easy to see, oh, well, this is just about maybe something on the other side of the world, and then how to connect that with things happening in local. But I mean, when it comes to issues around, say, women's rights, I mean, championing kind of anti-domestic abuse legislation. No, that's actually tied in with the Convention on the Elimination of Discrimination Against Women, one of those conventions that almost the entirety of the rest of the world has signed on to, and the US has not ratified that. Now, I feel like that's a huge shame and for us, but you can do things, but there are movements around the US right now to actually get individual cities to sign on to the norms that were really established in that convention, or so CEDAW is what it's named, the Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination Against Women and Girls. Now there are cities for CEDAW all over the US. And so kind of in the same way that you see with the Paris Climate Accords, the federal government withdraws from it, but guess what happens instead? You start to see cities and states and corporations and other groups kind of step into the void in some ways and say, you know what? We stand for this, and we can start to enact change from the ground up in a grassroots kind of way. And I think that's really exciting, and maybe a silver lining on some of this, right? I mean, if even at the federal level, there isn't always that commitment, it can happen in other ways. And I think it really shows how the world we live in, right? It is interconnected, and it's more than just states. It's more than just states. Communities, states, states within the US, corporations, other groups, you can really do a lot.
Yeah, and then kind of branching out from just a US perspective, I think more globally, what does this sort of rising global skepticism mean for organizations like the UN, even in the EU feeling the effects of Brexit and possibly other nations leaving? What path does that set and precedent does that set for the United Nations? And so thank you, Daniel, for that question as well.
Yeah, so it's, you're referencing, I think, this kind of rising tide of nationalism.
Isolationism and nationalism.
Right? And I would say that, yes, that the UN and other groups and and those of us who are kind of working toward cooperation as much as we can, I think that it is really incumbent on us, and I would urge all those to kind of, rather than just necessarily pit nationalism and international cooperation as mortal enemies, right? That nationalism must be defeated in order to have international cooperation. I'm going to say that you don't need to do that, that you can harness some aspects of nationalism and hopefully kind of turn that into a positive force wherever possible, or at least recognize the power of nationalism. But also, again, going back to history, in the 19th century, those nationalist figures in Europe were rebelling against monarchies and empires, and they saw nationalism as an important democratic development that would lead to greater representation among peoples and a greater recognition of the interconnectedness of peoples. And so I would say that you can work with nationalist rhetoric, and hopefully in order to build from that, rather than try to kind of defeat it on its face. And so, yes, because what we were working against ultimately is trying to undermine isolationism first and foremost. But I think nationalism, in some cases, not in all cases, some of the more virulent forms are truly destructive, and we need to be mindful of that because they're but I think that in many cases there is some possibility to actually work with some of these movements in order to just simply show that we are not going to be able to cut ourselves off from the world. You can certainly create more protectionist policies, but you're not going to stop the effects of climate change, no matter what policies you enact. We are connected globally, and we need to work with one another to find global solutions to our present day problems.
I guess my follow-up question to that is how do you approach an ideology that is seemingly apparently isolationist in value, speaking about nationalism and their sort of tie-ins with nationalism and isolationist policies. And I think there's a historic trend of that. But I think sort of we're now experiencing sort of a new rise of nationalism here in the United States and around different countries, sort of along the globe. How do you begin to broach discussion about multilateralism with like these global leaders that were elected on nationalist platforms, that were elected on isolationist platforms, and sort of still promote this liberal, multi-pluralist sort of global agenda when they themselves are pushing much more domestic, centrarian sort of policies at home?
Yeah, I mean, that's a $1 million question, right? I mean, like, how do you bridge that? Yes, because I think that it's a political problem for many of these leaders, right? You know, because they're trying to sell nationalism at home, and so involvement with these kind of multilateral organizations can seem like it's working against their interests. But I mean, frankly, involvement in multilateral organizations is absolutely essential. I mean, if you want to carry out a regional security agenda or enact any kind of economic policy that involves any kind of trade, it's absolutely essential. I mean, if you want to kind of coordinate on any kind of environmental or kind of energy work, and so it's a matter of, I think, and a word that hasn't been kind of brought up here is sovereignty, right? And saying that being a part of a multilateral organization does not in and of itself eliminate your sovereignty. That it's the power of countries to kind of selectively go in and to recognize the benefits of sharing in some of these obligations. And I think that those of us who are in favor of those kinds of things need to do a better job of making that case, and frankly, being honest about some of the drawbacks of integration, right? That certain segments have lost, and I mean, in a changing global economy, yes, that there will be certain segments that don't reap the benefits, and so we need to really democratize these international institutions and multilateral institutions, right? That we can't take those for granted and just say, oh yes, these are the ones that are there, and the way that they've operated, that's just how it is. And so, I mean, I would say maybe, kind of looking ahead, what do we need to do, kind of rather than just simply saying, propping up these multilateral organizations, we need to really question them and say, how do we make them more democratic, right? I mean, I think that it's absurd that there has never been a non-American to lead the World Bank. I think it's absurd. There's never been a non-European to be the managing director of the IMF. You know, the world's changed, and also the voting structure, right? I mean, the voting structure of these institutions needs to be reformed so that they really reflect the changing dynamics and the growth of new power centers around the world, and that includes the UN, frankly, right? The UN has a lot of work to do as well when it comes to you know, changing some of its structures, which are largely still embedded in amber from 1945, especially when it comes to Security Council personnel.
And so you've kind of touched on my next question a little bit already. And so the United Nations is certainly no stranger to vitriol, and the organization and its leadership has always been a sort of tempting target for politicians to seeking to score easy points. And these attacks come and go, but the sort of breadth and depth of animosity to multilateralism seems very much more open to question, because surveys are showing us now that there is strong public support for the organization amongst the people, generally speaking. And it's worked in most parts of the world. But sort of hand in hand with that, there seems to be this new phenomenon at work you spoke on a little bit, the resentment of sort of multilateral institutions emanating mostly from the anger that these distant world organizations see fit to judge the choices of national leaders. The head of the World Bank has always been an American. The IMF is always a European. And so upsetting these 186 plus nations around the world that feel like their voice isn't being heard by leadership in what seems like a very bureaucratic institution. And so sort of hand in part with that sort of discussion that we've been having, how involved should these multilateral institutions be in the internal members of its bodies?
Yeah, well, so just, yes, because this also touches on sovereignty. All right, so the UN and the issue of sovereignty and intervention. I think that well, let's just kind of get back to the key goals of the UN first. Keeping the peace, kind of conflict resolution. We know that the UN has made a statement on behalf of the responsibility to protect. Right. What is that saying? That is making a statement and on saying it's the limits, or it's really asserting a limit on sovereignty, saying that yes, states do have that right to set laws and control their own populations, but they have a responsibility to defend and protect rights. And if they're not doing that, then the international community has given itself that right to do something about that. All right. So yes, that has been stated, but of course, it's only been invoked once in the case of Libya in 2011. And of course, a lot of other cases like Syria have gone on, and the failure of the UN to act in those cases that can really undermine their stance on the responsibility to protect. But some of the other missions of the UN, when it comes to defending human rights, when it comes to kind of promoting the welfare of people, well, these are necessarily internal matters. As far as women's rights, human rights, nutrition, and so it seems to me like that. That you can't be making such a sharp distinction between what is external and what is internal as far as resolving some of the global challenges now. But you have to respect sovereignty. You have to respect the fact that democracy largely works right now. At a state-by-state level, and in the same way, you can't have the U.S. just simply asserting itself around the world. That is seen as an unfair imposition. I think that the UN too has to be careful about over assertions of, especially when it comes to humanitarian intervention and its notions of sovereignty.
So, kind of along the same lines, another question from the chat that we just got is, what would it take for these countries who are currently feeding off the current power structures to relinquish their sort of advantage in these UN institutions? Which is, yes, of course, the question everyone is trying to decide.
Well, yeah. How do you get great powers that have veto power in the Security Council to relinquish their veto power, or to at least admit maybe other countries? I think maybe this is kind of the implication I'm inferring from the question, right? And yes, and that's a very hard thing. The U.S. has said that we are open to getting more permanent members into the Security Council, right? Officially, or at least in the past, we've said that. I don't know what the Trump administration officially has said about that, whether they've changed even that stance. But it's all been talk. Now, this actually runs in both directions. So not only do you have the existing members, of course, when you have a lot of power, it takes a lot to relinquish a little of that or to share more. But I'd say that if you're concerned about legitimacy and you want the organization to work, that it's going to take that kind of effort. But it's also going to take, from the other side too, there are competing plans right now, at least when it comes to the UN and the Security Council. I don't know. I don't want to get into a sidetrack issue about UN Security Council reform, but there are three different groups, each with their own plans for how to democratize the UN Security Council. There's one group. The group of four. So Japan, Germany, India, and Brazil. They want to be new permanent members, plus other members, and then expand the Security Council to a total of 23. Right now, it's 5 permanent members and 10 non-permanent members for a total of 15. So there's one group. This group of 4 wants to get on. There's another group that's South Korea, Italy, Pakistan, and Argentina, who are in their own ways kind of rivals to this first group. They want to be permanent members. And then there's a third group coming out of the African Union saying that we need 6 new permanent members in addition to the 5 we have now. And 2 of those, a minimum of 2, need to come from Africa, right? I mean, and so, but as long as you have these competing plans from other parts of the world, it's going to be very difficult. I mean, I'm quite pessimistic about seeing UN Security Council reform anytime in the near future because of that. All right, but that's not to say that there aren't other areas in which you can really do quite a lot, and to bring in other voices and to bring in other states. I mean, especially China, India, into other multilateral institutions, to really have them feel like they are playing a larger role with security and economic matters. I mean, I think there are regional security organizations that are being created. I mean, I think that the UN can work more effectively with them to give them more responsibilities. There are new developments, so you probably know the Asian Infrastructure and Investment Bank and other development organizations that don't just that aren't based only out of Washington, but that can serve as, I think, kind of help to democratize, or at least show there are other centers of power when it comes to investment opportunities. So, the UN itself has its own, it's a bureaucracy and it's hard to manage at times, but there are other institutions as well that can be brought in.
And then, so kind of pivoting, bringing up sort of a rise of other powers in these UN institutions, I think of specifically China, and there's been a lot of questions in the chat about how does the UN and sort of the international community address the supposed human rights violations in China, with many in the chat also bringing up that it seems as though many are afraid to sort of push China on these issues due to the seemingly economic implications that any sort of humanitarian push could cause China to sort of reel in and cause economic devastation kind of globally. So how can sort of international institutions, bodies, nations, either multilaterally or bilaterally, begin to address some of these issues and humanitarian crises and engage in productive conversations with China? And sort of what do you see as the effects of those conversations?
Yeah, that's a very good question and a real thorny one. I mean, I think that China has been really effective in shutting down a lot of those kind of critiques. I mean, as they frankly have become more involved in international organizations. I mean, China wants to do more with the UN Human Rights Council at the same time as the U.S. withdrew. Kind of speaking of another body that the U.S. withdrew from, the U.S. is not on the UN Human Rights Council, and so I mean, I'd say for starters, I'd say kind of first thing is the U.S. needs to re-engage in the Human Rights Council and then start to work cooperatively, kind of collectively with lots of other groups, not somehow just kind of promoting its own agenda, but really kind of working with not just Europeans, but people from the Middle East and from Asia to try to achieve a new kind of dialogue around human rights that maybe undermines what the Chinese have sometimes said about saying, oh, this is just a Western imposition, that this is not a truly universal. I mean, I would push back and say, no, actually, this is a universal declaration and almost all states have signed on to it. And this matters, right? And so, I mean, I think that it's a matter of really rallying other groups, the Muslim world, for instance, right? In which you might say, oh, that they're not defenders of human rights. Well, yes, no, they are. Now they have to be different. They have a different way into this question. But for too long, I think kind of Westerners might have not kind of seen like Islam, for instance, as a good foundation on which to kind of build upon for human rights protections. And I think that there are movements happening in that part of the world to actually show no, that you can respect that. And you better believe that the Muslim communities in Western China are very much advocates of a human rights agenda, right? So it just seems to me like that there is an opportunity for a real consensus building around these issues, and that China can be isolated more than they have been. But it's going to take real engagement and real listening, and it can't be this kind of heavy-handed, kind of Western-based scolding that has been happening before.
So do you think saying this matters is enough, though, and consensus building is enough? It seems as though, the UN, for all of its successes, has also experienced a multitude of failures as well. I'm thinking sort of the multiple genocides that have occurred since its inaction, and veto power within the Security Council has become counterproductive now. This, of course, building off of several questions in chat. Jake referencing Rwanda and the fact that UN peacekeepers were there but didn't have the authority to intervene. And so how do you grapple with these failures for an institution not being able to step in necessarily when the time had come for it to step in, and sort of what is the path forward?
Absolutely. Well, I mean, I think that let's separate these issues. I mean, obviously, one is when you have active crimes against humanity, possible genocide. I mean, that's one matter where I think UN intervention or some kind of military intervention, and then followed on by peacekeeping forces, are absolutely could be justified, right? But I mean, I think that in other situations, like with the Uyghurs, for instance, I mean, I think that it would be a real mistake for the UN to suddenly tomorrow to organize some kind of military intervention. I mean, I'm not suggesting that's what Jake is proposing here, but there need to be kind of other forms of pressure. So sanctions or links to certain kind of development and loans to good governance. I mean, in the same way that there are kind of anti-corruption measures built into any kind of deals dealing with investment and development, that we need to build in human rights into those kinds of partnerships as well, and to really make human rights an integral part of any kind of trade deal, kind of investment package, development initiative. The SDGs, right, need to be incorporated into the language, and there has to be some teeth to it, right? And I mean, up to sanctions, and even depending on what's happening, obviously, you don't want to kind of get to the point in which you have to have military intervention, because I think that's opening up another can of worms that I think that the UN doesn't want to do yet. But yeah, it is a hard one, and you're right in the sense that China, at least thus far, partly because the U.S. has not been as engaged, has been able to get the upper hand in a lot of these discussions in these multilateral forums.
And so, kind of before we close, in the next sort of 15 minutes, taking sort of more broad questions from delegates and those in chat, I wanted to kind of close on the note that, working in the UN, I've witnessed a lot of the discourse surrounding the reform of the organization firsthand, whether that be structurally or on its messaging. And we've seen the adoption of the notion of building back better by the Joe Biden campaign, and sort of in UN messaging, and this idea that the COVID-19 pandemic and the economic devastation that it's caused has, in addressing those issues and in building back our institutions, we should build them back in a better way, in a more economically sustainable way, in a more just way, in a way that promotes fairness and equity. And so what do you see as building back better, and sort of the overarching path forward for this multilateral institution that is the United Nations?
Yeah, I'd say the last decade plus should serve as a real note of humility for the United States, for Europe, for some of these kind of traditional powers, right? Because whether it is in the 2008, 2010 economic crisis, subsequent recession, to then now the response to the coronavirus, to others. I mean, like, this should really kind of force us to kind of reckon with this easy notion that we've had, far too easy of a notion, that we have a superior system, right? And that it's just simply a matter for everyone else to then adopt it, right? I mean, that's been the ingrown position. And so to build back better means we need to stop just simply assuming that the political and the economic structures that have been built by the West are the models, and that all others need to follow, and that if they're not following it, this is a problem. I think that we need to be far more humble in that approach, and to build back better with real partnerships, now, but to do that in a way that doesn't sacrifice, of course, a human rights agenda, right? And so I'm not saying abandon human rights to just China's version of state sovereignty. I'm not, but I think that we need to be far more focused on how kind of others view kind of political and economic, or what they see as the good life, and what they want to work toward isn't necessarily going to be exactly how we have seen it. And frankly, how we've seen it over the last few decades, is that even sustainable? And is that what we want moving forward? So, I just think that the idea of just kind of going back and mindlessly trying to reproduce what we were after in the 1940s and 50s and 60s is not going to really address the problems we have in front of us, and we need to really change our institutions to reflect the changing global balance of power.
I couldn't agree more. Well, thank you, Dr. Anderson. I now want to open the questions in the chat and in the discussion to more broad themes and anything that the delegates would like to see kind of addressed. The first question being for those seniors in the chat, someone had asked, in approaching faculty to conduct research in sort of political science or IR spaces, what is best practice? How do you do that? What is a good way to reach out to faculty? And what do you look for in sort of your research assistants?
Yeah, so at UT Austin, there is a way for you to search faculty by subject area. I think it's called Eureka is the name of it. And so you can actually find faculty members and just who are working on certain subjects. And I would, first off, just as a bit of advice, it would make a big impression on me, certainly, if someone showed up to my office hours who wasn't even in my class, right? Someone says, I'm just interested in these issues, and can you recommend things for me to read? Where should I go? Well, that doesn't happen very often, but when it does, that really makes a big impression, right? Just someone who's like, what should I be reading on this? I'm interested. And so you're interested in these issues. You're here on a Saturday. You clearly are. And so I would do that. Don't feel like you have to wait until you are in that professor's class to actually reach out and to contact them. So you can establish that contact, and then when you do take a class with that person eventually, it sounds like that you will, then there'll already be that relationship. They'll know you, and if they don't even have something, they may be able to recommend you to a colleague who is working on something similar, right? So I would encourage you to do that, and I would look at research. Yes, working one-on-one with professors is one way, but there are other research labs and opportunities. Certainly at UT Austin, you can find ways to get involved in undergraduate research. I would really encourage you to do that, whether it's through your coursework or through other initiatives. We have Innovations in Peace and Development, which is a research opportunity that actually connects undergrads with graduate students at the LBJ school, as well as faculty in the public policy program there. So it's a great way to just reach out and to get connected with graduate students and faculty who are working on policy based issues. So those would be two of the things I would say first.
And kind of speaking from a student perspective, for those of you considering UT Austin as your institution to pursue a degree in international relations, at first you may not think, oh, UT's in Texas, I want to go to school on the East Coast, kind of to be in the hub of things. I've really found sort of studying IR at UT to be extremely beneficial. UT has a number of centers, the Clement Center for National Security, the Strauss Center for, I think, also national security. And like Dr. Anderson already mentioned, the Peace and Development, or the Innovations for Peace and Development Research Lab. So there's all of these wonderful institutions here based out of the university to not only provide you with research opportunities, but also financial assistance to go out and sort of study and put into practice sort of the things and apply what you're learning and researching. There's all sorts of sort of grad or undergraduate funding opportunities for not only research, but unpaid internships and things that you might want to pursue past your studies. And of course, one of the key components of sort of the IRG degree at UT Austin here is a study abroad experience. And now, of course, COVID has made that a bit more complicated, but the fact is that there's an abundance of resources here at UT Austin to sort of help promote and put you on a path towards sort of international relations. And I don't know if you wanted to touch on anything that I may have missed, Dr. Anderson's, but I would encourage you all to consider UT Austin for your undergraduate international relations degree. But with that, I'm going to check chat for any last questions before we sign off and you all head back to your committees. So I guess the last question that I see is on that subject: what can high schoolers do to get involved in sort of these sorts of spaces, or begin sort of studying international relations, given that they don't really have classes to do it in? What would you encourage them to start reading, looking at, listening to?
As far as reading up, I mean, as far as kind of keeping up with the world. Well, I would urge you to really to just focus on your foreign language classes, and whenever you can get kind of regional study. I mean, obviously, travel is difficult now, but that makes a real difference. I mean, I think that for even kind of students who want to just kind of go into government work and public policy work and going to Washington, having strong language skills and regional area focus, that is a real difference maker. So, I mean, if you can start to work on those languages now, start to show some interest in that, then that's great. I mean, obviously, in addition to reading The Economist and the and Foreign Affairs, and kind of keeping up with those, with world events more generally, which is what you're, I'm sure, doing anyway. Those kind of underlying kind of language skills, I'd say that you can build those up, and then you can get into more kind of social science research based projects, obviously, when you get to college. But that'd be what I would say to start now.
Thank you, Dr. Anderson. Thank you for this wonderful discussion that we've had this past hour. With that, I want to close things out and thank all of the delegates that have joined us today, and invite you now back in the next 7 or so minutes to get situated before you rejoin your committees for your afternoon panel discussion, or your afternoon committees. So thank you again, Dr. Anderson. It's great speaking with you as always, and have a good rest of your weekend.
Thank you, Nick, and thanks to you all for the great questions. And and I wish you the best with the rest of the conference, and also your future careers in international affairs. We need you. Has this ended, or are you still waiting for it to?